So we went over the formation of America from the first 13 colonies all the way to the first Revolutionary War, all the way up to the first Civil War, and then the manifest destiny and expansion westward, which ultimately led to the formation of the 50 states of America that we know today. So this ultimately led up to World War I, World War II, and then we had the civil rights movement, which I'm going to just talk about a little bit today. You know, this is some more recent history that we've learned about throughout school. But just like going over the Civil War, I realized it's important that we remind ourselves and go back over these historical moments, because when we forget our history, then we fall victim to falling into those same mistakes from our past. So we're just going to talk about a couple of things from the civil rights movement. So really, after the first Civil War, that brought us to the freeing of the so-called slaves. So now these slaves are free, and now Black people really, of course there's some excitement, but also there's a lot of growing pains for Black people and also just the country in general, with dealing with white people as well, that, they still want to hold on to their old ways. So this leads us into the era of Reconstruction. So you have these, millions of freed slaves, and, they want to, many of these people already know trades from slavery, whether it's building houses, farming, working in industry. So many of these Black people already are very skilled, and Reconstruction was meant to bring these Black people in a sense, I don't want to say Americanize them, but just incorporate them into society in a successful way. But also throughout this period is where you get the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And these were really just white people that were furious about Black people enjoying freedom. And many people felt threatened by these Black people as well. So it kind of reminds me of the Israelites in Egypt, where, these are God's people, but the Egyptians and Pharaoh are basically intimidated and concerned about the Israelite success. So back in back in America, we have the forming of the KKK. And this is really for lack of better terms, a terror organization. So this is where you get the lynchings, where you get the burnings of houses, you get these mobs, and, of course, those sacred ceremonies in the hills of the burning crosses from these Christians. So, these KKKs, they wore hoods. I guess they were trying to hide their identities for whatever reason. So So really, these KKK people set out on a trail of terrors, and many Black people were lynched as a result of this. And really, you also get the formation of the modernization of the police force, because the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves also had a kind of a loophole in there that said, unless these people are basically prisoners. So that was a loophole of slavery. So you get the rise of the KKK, but also you get the growing of, from these slave patrols, they're now becoming policemen. So, many of these KKK people with these masks on and, the pointed hoods, or some of them were police officers, some of them were governors, some of them were doctors. So, hey, you see the same things in modern times. So, hey. So really, to combat this, it really leads us up to the civil rights movement. In this era, you really get the movements like the Black Panther Party, you get Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and you get Malcolm X. you also get, and this leads us up to also Rosa Parks and her protest on the bus, where she's like, okay, I'm not moving from the bus, because at that time, Black people weren't permitted to sit in the front of the bus. That was a position reserved for white people. So, before this time, Rosa Parks is already pretty big as a political activist. So this, she was already used to this kind of um, these kind of conflicts. So, when this event happened, this really triggered the bus protest. And this was a movement that really also is where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came in. And because he was this church leader, and he had basically used the church as a basically as a front for his revolution as well. So he used his influence to influence this protest and also the further parts of this peaceful protest and the civil rights movement. So with these bus protests, you have a situation where Black people were like, okay, well, we're just not going to ride the bus, and in that way, we're going to affect you guys' economy. So that was just a way of showing solidarity, almost like a Boston Tea Party. So it's just showing solidarity, and it's showing the Black people's effect on the economy. Like, okay, so you guys are gonna have these racial laws of segregation, then okay, then we're not gonna support you guys' business. And, because at that time there was a lot of segregation. There's just many different things going on, racism, issues with voting rights, also segregation from schools, segregation. They had Blacks only water fountains, Blacks only train cars, shoot, Blacks only restrooms, Blacks only restaurants, or, a Black entrance, or maybe Blacks had to go through the back. So there's just a lot of segregation going on in the division of the country. So, some Black people in modern times, we argue like, okay, well, integration was ultimately, they say basically was bad for us because, we lost a lot of wealth from, being segregated as well, from having our own schools and our own businesses, like the Negro Leagues as well. So when you think about, the Negro Leagues and Jackie Robinson's incorporation into baseball, then, in some ways maybe they were right, but, ultimately integration was a good thing for the sake of society and for the sake of the world. Because now you have a country where all people are finally created equal. So this also leads into the integration of the school system, like Little Rock 9 in Arkansas at Central High. And so now you have the situation of Little Rock, Arkansas, where Dwight D. Eisenhower was our president, and he wasn't necessarily concerned with racism. He was this white man. He was a veteran of the world wars. So it wasn't necessarily his personal interest to, support integration, especially of these Little Rock Nines into this high school. But ultimately, these problems just ended up showing up basically at the Oval Office to his desk. So he basically ended up taking these issues on. So you have a situation where the governor of Arkansas, he was against this integration, but Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was a federal law of the Union that these kids were able to integrate into these schools. So during this time, you do get a lot of schools shutting down or just becoming private schools. So this is also where you get a lot of these private schools from. So the governor of Arkansas, he actually so you have a situation where these 9 Black students are trying to integrate into this school. So before these Little Rock 9 could even get a chance to walk in through the doors of this high school, you have a situation where the governor of Arkansas, Governor Fabbis, he was against that integration. So the multiple ways that they used to stop this integration was the police and local mobs. But also, Governor Fabbis took it a step further, and he actually sent the National Guard to the school. And he was saying, it was to keep the peace, but really he sent the National Guard there specifically to prevent these Africans from getting into the high school. So you have a situation where these students can't even get into the school. So, this was in direct opposition to the federal law of Dwight D. Eisenhower. So you have the situation where the Governor Fabbis is directly contradicting the orders of President Eisenhower. So ultimately, Eisenhower takes this as an offense, and so Eisenhower sends the army in. So he sends in these airborne troops in. So now you have a situation where it's almost like it's almost similar to the Civil War 100 years prior, to where you have Abraham Lincoln going against, these Confederates that aren't trying to uphold the Union laws and regulations. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was almost like a more modern Abraham Lincoln, and he sends in the army to help these Little Rock 9 from Arkansas get into the Central High. So basically, from here, you have Eisenhower making a statement that, these governors, you guys are not going to rebel against the Union. We're not going to have this again. And so this is a statement. And after this point, you do get more of these schools integrated. So now this leads into the era of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And we know their stories where, Dr. Martin Luther King was more about a peaceful approach. And Malcolm X, he was more about the approach of, any means necessary. He's like, you guys been bamboozled, hoodwinked, okay? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Okay. So you have situations where you have Malcolm X going to Egypt, getting enlightened and coming back and just bringing his enlightenment back to the Americas. And also, he was a part of the Nation of Islam. So there was a big movement there. And ultimately, Malcolm X gets assassinated during one of his speeches by, supposedly by the Nation of Islam, but supposedly by the federal government. And then Dr. Martin Luther King gets assassinated a couple years after giving his I Have a Dream speech and his march on Washington with millions of people there, millions watching this famous speech where he says, I have a dream. And, you fast forward to modern times and his dream is more of a realization today, especially when you have the presidents like Barack Obama. So it just shows how much we've changed as a society. But eventually, Dr. Martin Luther King was also assassinated as well. And at the time, you have John F. Kennedy as president. Okay. And actually, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So then you have Robert F. Kennedy giving the speech about Dr. Martin Luther King being assassinated. So really, this was a time where these, I'll say, revolutionary leaders are getting assassinated by this oppressive government and society. Okay. So there's just many things going on with the civil rights movement. And these are just a few of the heroes and characters. But there were many marches. You know, you have situations where the police are sicking dogs on civilians and hosing them down with water hoses from fire trucks, just powerful fire hoses, hosing people down, ripping against, tearing their flesh apart. And these dogs just chewing away at these civilians. So it's this whole civil rights movement. There's so much tension in the air. There's so much going on. There's a lot of terror with the KKK. There's a lot of terror from, these Black people trying to rebel. So there's different ideologies on all sides of the spectrum. But ultimately, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, you get John F. Kennedy finally passing the Civil Rights Bill. But then he's ultimately assassinated. But eventually, so then after we have President Lyndon B. Johnson, and now then he ultimately passes the Civil Rights Bill. And this is 1965. So finally, Black men get the rights to vote, and finally, Black people are free 100 years after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. So you just have a situation where this is 100 years of Black people and being under this oppressive system of Jim Crow, and just many things like voting laws and different things that's meant to oppress them and take away their power, whether subtly or overtly. So we finally get the Civil Rights Bill in 1965, okay, which basically says that we have the right to vote, finally. So after the Civil Rights Act and the civil rights movement as a whole, this leads us to modern times where women gets the right to vote, and the feminist movement. You get the rights for Mexicans. You get more rights for women, the feminist movement. You get the LGBT movement as well. So really, the movement for Black freedom pushes a lot of other people's movements as well. And that just leads us to modern times where, we also we end up having the war on drugs, which was really a war on Black people, but they call it the war on drugs, where the police are able to kind of go back to slave era ways and Jim Crow ways, to where now Black citizens are getting stopped and frisked in the street. So though we try to avoid the racism of the past, many of these governors are still hell bent on holding on to their racist ways, whether it's for money, for greed, or just racism, just pure racism and hatred. So either way, we get our Barack Obama as president. You get many more Black governors, just in office in general, many more Black CEOs and politicians, and just all across the board, you just get a more integrated society. So that leads us up to the present day. And honestly, a lot of things have changed for the good, but there is still people that want to hold on to the hate from the past. They don't want to learn from the lessons of history, regardless of for whatever reasons. But regardless, we have our integrated society, and, humans are human. So, we still have issues, like the war on drugs. You also have redlining of neighborhoods This is more about the more modern day, from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s to the present time. So you get a lot of redlining of neighborhoods. You get a big push of pushing African Americans into ghettos, which these ghettos is where Hitler got his idea from, his ghettos and his persecution of the Jews in Germany. So you get a big push of these African Americans into these ghettos, and just redlining of neighborhoods where Black people can't get the same loans as white people. So even up into modern times, there's still many issues and subtle ways and laws that still provide for ways of segregation in subtle ways. But regardless, you still have African Americans pushing for a better society, and all Americans, whether white, Black, Mexican, Asian. You just have a society where people are pushing for the rights of humanity. So this leads us up to the 2000s, around like 2018 to 2020, where you get the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is basically a modern protest, a modern push against the systems of racism in the police system, the systems of redlining, and the George Floyd incident, where George Floyd was ultimately killed by the police. That really does trigger this Black Lives Matter movement. So now we've talked about America from the 13 colonies all the way to the first Civil War. Now it's led us to the Civil Rights Movement. And finally, we get the rights to vote and the rights of integration. And now this leads us to the Black Lives Matter movement.